Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the call. This is a call that we kind of planned out earlier this week. And the idea was that we wanted to start a podcast kind of a thing around technology, society, how it's integrating, stuff like that. So it's a flowing conversation. We'll see how it goes.
I think the idea of this conversation was because I'm really interested in understanding, how technology interacts with geopolitics and how the world is interacting with it, and the context where India is, and probably just a discussion or brainstorming, soundboarding with all of you, that where are we going with technology, because it's just rapidly going on and on. Like, this there's this startup, not a startup, but Chayos is there. They've already started having facial recognition in their systems. I mean, of course, there's a consent of the user in case they want to give their photo or not. But how are they operating in a system where there is no regulation around facial recognition? So yeah, just a conversation around technology and how we're going about it.
I work with Hackergram. I came to the call because I'm interested in the conversation. I'm not a techie, and I understand technology and geopolitics at a certain level because of the kind of work that we do. So I'm just keen to hear more on this.
I'm by profession, by education, I'm an economist. I have worked in like web development and actually development in general for the last 1 or 2 years, and I am basically very much interested in the concept of money and how money is being changed with the use of technology. And also, I mean, and you cannot keep geopolitics away from that the money conversation for long. So how all those things add up and how these things actually affect the politics of the world.
I'm a rural entrepreneur, and I run a computer educational center called TechZone Academy in a rural area in Uttarakhand, and I'm also a co-founder of Hackergram. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So I guess everybody's familiar with my background to some degree, so I won't go into that. The reason that, and so it's a good time to kind of segue into why we wanted to have this call in the first place. The reason I'm very interested in having this conversation is because this has been the kind of core focus of my work for the last 10 odd years. In the sense of getting access to remote areas always involves understanding the legality and the commercials that go into technology access and proliferation. And so it's been an area of study for me for a fair amount of time. And of late, obviously, particularly since 2014-15 period, it's become increasingly clear that the future of information conflict or information warfare seems a little bit extreme, because I don't think war as a large scale thing is anymore a thing of the present. But in terms of how countries engage with each other, how societies engage with each other, technology access and proliferation makes a huge difference to that now. So it's a particularly good time to start talking about these things, and start finding out how the people we interact with, the people we trade with, the people we work with, what do they think about access? How do they relate to it? Because that's really what will give us a good sense of the things to come. Whether it's going to be a very controlled environment similar to People's Republic of China, or is it going to be a more open environment similar to the United States of America? How is it going to look? To get an understanding of that, it's very important that we start talking about these things to the people around us. And I'm hoping that this series of conversations will serve as a basis for that. I'm hoping we can at least put part of this discussion out on the internet as a podcast of sorts, and then start having people listen into it and tell us what they think, and then we can possibly start going into some of the conversations that look more important than others. That's the broad sense I had in mind. If there's anything anybody would like to add to that, we can take a round for that, and then we can get into the conversation itself.
From you, I wanted to understand because I don't know much about what a Hackergram does. So I really want to know that what you guys are involved with and what do you work on, where are you based out from. So if you can just give me a brief detail about that, that will be.
So in terms of Hackergram, we've been working since 2013, 12-13 period on another project called CGNet Swara. And from there, this idea came out that, if you're looking at citizen journalism and media, it's not something which you can attract either foreign funds in charity for or raise revenue locally, because advertising, if you go down the advertising route, then you're again back in the same zone as everybody else. So we were looking for ways and means to sustain something, which is social in nature, which doesn't, which you don't necessarily want to tie down to a commercial revenue model in the traditional sense on day one. How do you sustain something like that? And so we realized that probably the best way to do it is to find surpluses and things you can reuse, and that's really the only way. Because these are those things which people start thinking about when there's when the basics are met. And so we actually got an old mushroom farm. I don't know if you've been to the Bhopal facility. That entire place was built out of 3 old sheds, and it essentially became a newsroom and a citizen journalism training center, mostly using open source software, cheap technology, a lot of local social networking, all of that. And we ended up training about 160 odd citizen journalists over the period of a year. That was the measurement period that we put for it. And that was the kind of the big success story for us. That, okay, great, it's possible to do this. This model broadly works. Now let's see what else we can apply it to. So from there, we went to Karnataka and we spent a year in the jungles there, seeing if we could build a model around rural connectivity. And that was where the cow mesh and Wi-Fi mesh models came out of. We had a great community over there, which was 3 villages. So we set up a local mesh network. And we the experiment that we were doing there was, what's the impetus that gets people in the community to really adopt it? Because back in those times, 2G connectivity was all you had in the village. Most people from that particular village were going to the city to work. So they didn't, the men were getting their internet fix in the city any which way. And who really cares about the village and what's happening over there? So the model we tried was that we went and took a Raspberry Pi and we hooked it up to a television set, and we said, okay, this is now a Pi-Fi TV. And it's a family unit. It's a shared unit that's not accessed only by one person in the family. It's sitting in the middle of the house generally. So it's kind of a shared family experience on the internet. We wanted to see if that would actually fly. The idea has received good feedback from people, and it's also we haven't had a scaled deployment, so we kind of don't know whether it works really well. But we'd love to experiment more with that. In fact, that's one of the areas that we're going to be looking at. Hopefully this year. We just had a conversation with Alto Mundi in Latin America. Longer segue to that. Post Karnataka, we realized that while it's possible to work in an extremely rural environment, we also wanted to test out urban. So we spent a year in Bangalore, tried to see if any of our projects fit over there. But the Bangalore scale and revenue thought process is very different from the rest of India. And so we realized that the kind of work we're doing is not really cut out for specifically for that kind of an urban scale. So then we moved to Uttarakhand, and for the last 3 odd years we've been here. I think we found our source spot, I think for a fair amount of time. And so we spent some time in the Almora district, 2 years over there. And now we're in the Nainital district, Nokuchia Tal, where we've got a hacker space of our own, and that's what we're trying to build up as the base of operations. So if you now look on Google Maps, you'll find Hackergram is listed in Nainital district. So do you have any opening stuff that you've kind of had? So I like the opening with the Chayos bit. This is interesting. So face what are they face recognizing you for? What's that deal about?
So the thing is that the minute you enter the Chayos restaurant, you have an option. They have a small iPad sort of thing and you log in your details, and they also have a facial recognition system where you can put in your photo, and if you're giving your consent, then that photo will be stored and your services are accordingly customized.
Oh wow!
For
So
example,
basically, when you walk into Chayos, they don't really need a human server. They can have an AI greet you by your name and stuff like that.
perhaps that is the idea, right? Like in future, they could go to this.
Right. Okay. So I mean, so that's what so you can kind of see where it's going, right? The broad idea is to be able to hand off as much as you can to the computer, so that one, your cost of labor goes down. You can get a far less qualified or far less trained person to do manual labor than doing something as complex as providing a pleasant customer experience, for example.
I mean, it's a constant conflict that, yes, you're working with a corporate, you're working with someone that is in support of lesser unionization, lesser rights of individuals, and probably a sort of control over technology. It might be very different from what the government of India tries to do, but they have their own set of agenda. So for me, it's a constant question that how in this space can I make the most of it, understand it all, not get consumed completely by their own agenda, but have a clear picture for myself as well.
Okay, so that's a broad question because there's a lot of ethics involved there, right? And ethics are deeply personal. So I wouldn't want to prescribe ethics to anyone. That aside, see, corporates play a role. There's a reason why they exist. There's a reason why they've evolved to what they are today. And it's not, I mean, you can kind of simplify it down and say it's all about human greed and stuff like that. But there's more to it. There's mechanics to it. There's a specific reason why it went this way. Because if you look at the old 1860s, the reason that companies came about is risk sharing, because it was impossible for individuals to take on the risk of doing business alone and without having the structured support of other people, which could later be enforced by another support system called law. So these are evolutionary patterns that have come about over a long period. So just saying that companies are evil is kind of very, very generalistic in my opinion. In terms of agendas, there are the agendas in human interactions are always very, very simple. They're very behavioral in nature. Ultimately, we're driven by very fundamental drives. Freud's done a great job of explaining those. We've got a very nice documentary called The Century of the Self. It's a BBC documentary set of 4 pieces, which we recommend to everybody. It's almost like required reading if you're doing a course with Hackergram. But it's not reading, it's more like watching. It's 4 hours of documentary watching. And it really explains very well how it's within any group, you'll realize that certain people are able to understand the drives of other people a little bit better than everybody else. And so those people will start becoming the providers of services. Okay, I do this well, and I know how to position it to you in such a way that you will find it attractive. And then I find my place by being of service. So if you look at corporate agendas, those agendas are very simple. It's to maximize shareholder wealth. And if you talk to anybody, given that most people don't like to think of themselves as evil, if you talk to a CEO of a big corporate, they think they're doing a great social service. Jeff Bezos was in India recently. He said, I'm going to invest $1 billion. Got a cold shoulder. Nobody was very nice to him about it. But he thinks he's doing a great job. He thinks he's God's gift to mankind. And honestly, he's not all that unjustified in thinking it, because when he wants to be nice to someone, he can be really nice to them. So there's all those things to consider as well. But broadly speaking, yes, companies' agendas are to cut costs, and how it's becoming very clear is as the future comes up upon us. Labor rights and the fact that human beings generally feel a sense of camaraderie towards their species over and above other species results that most people would like to say things like, I like equal labor rights. at the very, I mean, you may do nothing to implement it. You may have no commitment to that outcome in practicality, but at least you like to say that I stand for equal rights and gender equality, equal pay for equal work, and things like that. And therefore, for companies to be able to deliver profit while meeting those standards that are put upon them by society is becoming increasingly difficult. And the solution they've opted for is that, hey, we can just, okay, you don't want us to mistreat human beings, fine, we just won't work with human beings, we'll put machines in there. And so that's really what's driving, to a large extent, the automation discourse, that, hey, you don't have to worry about labor rights with machines. And those of us who've been in the cyberpunk entertainment genre for a while, we know that this is kind of one of the projected dystopian futures, that humanity becomes increasingly dependent on machines to provide its livelihood. And a very small, obviously, when you get rid of the need for labor by human beings, you realize that a large chunk of the population is now pretty much what you can think of as dead weight. And so now the question becomes, how do we get rid of these guys? And how do we absolve ourselves of the responsibility of having to feed them, clothe them, worry about their healthcare, provide a decent standard of life? And so there you start seeing very interesting behavioral changes. Societies themselves will voluntarily start discarding people, and we're seeing a lot of that happening in India today and all over the world. In fact, people don't like refugees, people want to know who their citizens are, people want to know who they're absolutely entitled to have to pay for, and just limit that number any way, shape or form. So that's really what's going on. In that, corporates are still going to play a role. Ultimately, they do provide livelihood to a large number of people. If you got rid of a corporate, the immediate result would be that all the people who work for that corporate suddenly now need to look for new livelihoods, and they're suddenly targets for the rest of the people who still have jobs to worry, okay, do I need to now worry about this guy's welfare? And so we need to find a way to coexist. I had a very interesting meeting as part of the Ashoka network with Bill Drayton recently. It was a conference call with a large number of us. And he said something very, very interesting. He was talking about the political divide in the US right now, which is very similar to the political divide in India or in the UK or anywhere else. And he was saying that, look, if you're sitting on this side or that side of the political divide, you really need to figure out what you're going to do to engage with people on the other side. Because short of that, what other options do we have? And so engaging and having those conversations and bringing it out into the open, these concerns, is what's important. And then we can make them more specific. So when you say that you're working with X corporate and you're kind of concerned about agendas in general, what does that mean for you? Like what are the concerns that drive you?
Okay, yeah, that's a more specific question. For example, like we do a lot of advocacy around personal data protection bill, and that, like you've already said, corporates have their own resources. So I think the idea is that how do you direct them, because there is a certain level of I won't say power, but capability that you have, that you can direct them to a certain direction at some point. So having this broader vision, if you talk to people around you who are not in corporates, who are not in part of corporates, who are working with think tanks or civil societies or other people, then you know that probably through your what you're driving can also be driven in a very specific way. Let's come to specifics. Let's talk about skilling of the labor. That is a big agenda in many big ticket item right now in many corporates. But what does that really mean? How much of responsibility are we willing to take? Because we are going to display some skills, not going to the direction where I'm saying that, okay, automation is completely going to, remove a lot of jobs, etc. But it's about skills, like how many people are we really skilling, and the quality of skills as well. I recently government has come up with this mandate, and it's all mandate driven, right? Like it's all about the numbers somehow, that we want to skill these n number of people, and so the state governments are like, okay, then we are going to hire locally so that we can give a quota of number of people that we have employed from our state. Then they push the corporates that you also implement this apprenticeship act. So this act is essentially where you have to hire trainees, you have to give them training, you pay them a certain stipend, but it's more like a certificate program. But when I went to the depth of it, when I saw what they're asking, and the accountability from the corporates, it's not as much. Like, these corporates can actually put in so many, because they hire so many people from campuses. It's really not about hiring quality or giving them quality training. It's about just giving them that number, so that these departments, labor commissioner departments, etc., state, they can give this number somewhere up, and they can get a tick mark, and then that number floats as a figure that we have skilled as many people. But what are those skills really? There are soft skills. Are we teaching our people emotional intelligence? Are we teaching them critical thinking? Is our society progressing like that? I really don't think so. Like, there was this really interesting debate on NDTV, I think. This was by Ruchir Gupta, who's also an economist, and he was talking about these 10 trends that are coming up, and one of the trends was that the world stands very polarized right now. And coming back to what pointed out, that there is one side that is, let's say, completely left for the sake of it, or completely right, and they're not ready to interact with each other at all. There is no dialogue. Everybody is standing in their silos, and they believe that what they think is absolutely right. So I think that area where we just need to have a dialogue of what's happening and what could really be done and what is the outcome we are looking for. Yes, we can have a tick mark. For example, we can say that, yeah, we want to hire so many people with disabilities, but are we really empowering them? Are we building an ecosystem for them? Yes, we want to have all these women leaders by 2023, but what kind of skills are we imparting them? Do we have in place basic things like sexual harassment committees? Are they functional at all, etc., etc.? So yeah.
Okay, so let me jump in there. So it's a broad area. So but I get the gist of what you're asking and talking about. See, there was a very interesting piece I was reading somewhere recently. I don't remember where it was, but it was talking about diversity and the need to protect it and all of those things. Yeah, and we obviously. I've been part of the development sector for the last 10 years. Before that, I was part of the corporate sector. In both those sectors, the desire to preserve diversity and individual expression is huge. It's one of the most driving things, because that's what drives consumerism. Catering to the individual's wants and needs and the expressions is what drives consumerism the best. And so that's what everybody likes to think in terms of. But when we think in very realistic terms, can we support that level of individual expression and fulfillment for every human being and every living being? If you start really extending it out there, can we really do it for everyone? Is it realistic? Is it feasible? And then you start to realize that actually, a lot of this ecosystem is about compromise. A lot of this ecosystem is about giving up stuff. It's about empathy. It's not. It doesn't look like gratification of a lot of things. But then what are the things that you're going to choose? It's again, if we've come to a point in humanity where there's a lot of choice, and we now as a responsible species need to make that decision of which of our choices are we going to let go. Having this discussion recently that natural selection, if you were living next to Kedarnath when the flood came and you died as a result of that, versus if you were killed as a result of your religious beliefs, how different are those two scenarios really from each other? Because religion, if at the peak of logical debate, is really a natural outcome. It's an expression of a species, so it's as natural as a flood, really, if you think about it. And so, how different is that selection really? It's a matter of debate, of course. We're at various stages in our perception with regard to phenomena, whether it's natural or not. But that said, I think to kind of put a little bit of a bound to the discussion, in terms of reality checks, when you start reaching that state where you're hitting 7.5 billion in population and you're wondering, how are you going to feed the next bunch of kids? People need to start thinking, do I really want to have kids? And so on and so forth, and really start, it's not so much self-censoring as self-disciplining. It's that just that kind of a time, in some mythologies it's about the cycle of change or whatever, however you want to see it. The time right now is for cutting down. And so everybody's doing it in their own way, shape or form. The corporates are doing it by trying to figure out how they can cut costs. So in terms of skilling and livelihood, what it boils down to is how many people can you train, and for how cheap, and how much certification goes with it, in the sense that how justifiable is that training to your higher authority. Meaning, if you have to show a receipt for a number of people trained, how simple is that process to follow? And we've had some experience, but we've had that experience with TechZone, which was started as a technology training institute in a village, with the idea that we were going to start imparting basic computing skills. And the market strategy was very clear for us. There's a set of government jobs available in the area and government offices. They pay roughly 7,000 rupees a month as a starting salary. In order to apply for that job, the eligibility criteria is that you need to have a certificate as a certified computer operator from an ISO certified institute. And you're good to go. I mean, that's it. All you need is that certificate that says this institute has an ISO certification, and in turn is certifying this person as a computer operator with these basic skills. It's generally Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and basic usage of the internet. So it's a fairly straightforward model in terms of skilling, and the kind of work that they end up doing is basic office work. Somebody needs an Excel sheet made, and obviously they start at a lower skill level and they would work on the job. So the boss will have some input to give, formatting aisi kar lo, ya something on those lines, and that's how they kind of grow. And in a year or two, they're at the next level, and so on and so forth. It's not very complex as a livelihood or career chart. And so for a 7,000 rupee initial job, the kind of cost that we were looking at the student incurring to acquire the skills was about 1,500 rupees over a period of 3 months. So you pay 500 rupees a month for on-premise classes where you get access to a computer, you can practice your stuff, and there'll be a live instructor who'll answer your questions. At the end of that 3-month period, you'll give an exam, which will be based on the same syllabus, make an Excel sheet, make a PowerPoint presentation, something on those lines. It'll be evaluated, and you'll be given a grade and a certificate. And the additional certification cost is maybe 250 rupees or 300 rupees as an examination fee. So this was, again, at the cost of about 2,500 rupees, you have access to a job which may pay you 7,000 rupees. So it's the kind of cost-benefit analysis, to our minds, worked out pretty well. When we tried to put this out on the ground, here's the challenges we came up with. So the first thing was that the Prime Minister's Kaushal Vikas Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, PMKVY, is one of these schemes that are part of the scaling schemes of the current regime. And so they had a model which was similar, where you would end up getting a certification in computer operation, similarly inclined, except that this certification was coming from the government. So the perceived value immediately goes up. Two, in the implementation, they had basically a bunch of private players involved, and there was a fair amount of messing around with the data in terms of biometric, attendance fraud, and things like that were expected of the private players. So we kind of bowed out our way out of that one. But at the end of the day, what it boiled down to was that on the one hand, a student had the option that they could go to one of these centers that was under the PMKVY, sign up with their biometrics, and kind of just go home and sit it out until they got the certificate at home, along with a little bit of cash probably. So they would then certify them. They would then list themselves as skilled, having may or may not acquired those skills. Whereas the counter offer was that you pay 2,500, come to a class where you'll be probably pushed to stretch yourself a little to learn, and then have to pass an exam to again access the same job. So the cost benefit analysis goes completely out of the window. I don't blame anybody for not showing up to our classes. It made no sense. So as a result of that, what we realized is that in order to scale up our business as a service provider for our own livelihood, what we would have to do is switch to a completely online model. So now we are experimenting with this model that we certify almost like a network marketer, a bunch of trainers who in turn have access to their own devices, 1 or 2 devices, like a computer, which they will take to the village and locally certify people, and then report that back to us via YouTube video transcript. So it's a model that we're working on. It's something that we probably will release in the next 2-3 months, but we've had to completely alter it, and it's now far more technology dependent than people dependent, if you think about it. The result is going to be that the students' interaction is going to be very limited. It's going to involve a lot more peer learning, and we are going to be largely focusing on the certification part of it. From a quality of skill imparting point of view, if you're a traditionalist and you like the classroom environment, it's horrible. I mean, you're basically providing no social interaction in the mix. But from a skilling perspective, it might just be the only way to scale it up and scale people quickly. Then the following question is, how do you employ all those skilled people, which honestly people don't really have an answer for at the moment. So what we are now looking at is more kind of wide spectrum livelihoods. Like you also have a cyber cafe, you also do a little bit of tourism, you also do this, you multitask.
If I may add here that personal ambition for skilling yourself, if it is not arts at a certain level, anything which is technical is largely driven by the job market anyway. If you asked youths or like somebody at that age and ask them what skill would you like to have, I don't think they can answer that isolatedly, apart from if it's not related to a job. They would say that. So the question people ask children is also, what would you want to be versus what kind of skills you would like to have. So skill is highly driven by job. You're required to have skills, not because you want to have them, but because you want to be employed. It really depends where you want to go in the job market, and on the basis of that you will be doing the skilling. And it's not about rural India or like people in the village or anything. Even like for students in cities, if you ask them that what skills would you like to have, they would probably tell you they want to study abroad, and as a result they need to be able to write better or do that. But it's always related to an end goal. It's never for a self satisfaction kind of a thing. Mostly those kind of skills we look in arts, not specifically as such, or with what we call recreational activities.
Yeah, so I mean, recreation and entertainment and kind of growing as people, for those who can afford it, is really looking like the next new sector, really. From the point of view of doing better for the bottom of the pyramid, or for the people who are in the worst conditions, the people who are engaged in doing that, I've been part of several development sector discussions lately. It's a flagging ship right now. I mean, people are going to have to really push and get themselves out of whatever hole they're in, because the people who were engaged in doing this as a social good are really facing a lot of pressure in being able to deliver that as a service. So it's a tough time, and I think if you have that goal of extending things to the last mile and to the last person, it's really important to start picking and choosing. It's like that Noah's Ark time. Who's going to make it? Who are the people who you can absolutely do something for to a certain quality standard? I mean, the moment you start saying, I want to scale this to 1 million people, things start breaking down. You can start scaling inside out and start categorizing. Okay, I can do this for this community, this for this community, this for this person. Set those goals up, because everybody's got a finite lifetime, and it's really, really important that we conserve those resources and bring that self-discipline in, even in the sector of doing good. That we're not going to be able to do it for everyone. Let's start doing better for those who we can do things for. That's a personal opinion. It's not. I don't expect it to be a prescribed way to go. But that's where I am at the moment. That we should really find the people who you can reach out to and then grab them tight.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And the example you gave, that how you sort of changed this traditional in classroom course to online course. You were adaptive. I think that's the whole idea, that you see your audience and you see how it's impacting them, and how you can just make the most of it. But I think this conversation is a subset of a larger conversation, and going back to what we decided we could discuss, I would like to table the topic of the growing protectionism in terms of data and technology all over the world, and then we can discuss India as a specific example. So,
could you qualify protectionism a little bit? When you say protectionism, how do you mean?
For example, that there is, we know that there is populism with a sort of nationalistic fervor in the geopolitics of the world right now, and the countries are moving towards protectionism where there's a growing mistrust in sort of bigger foreign brands, and countries are adapting protectionist policies. There's a trend towards deglobalization, which is sort of promoting localization, which is actually not localization for the communities. It's more driven by the governments. And countries like China, Russia, and even Indonesia and Vietnam, they've sort of come up with data localization policies, and they have them in place. Even Brazil, Colombia, and India are considering it, that they want to step away from the easternization of data. They're talking about, if you saw Ravi Shankar Prasad's speech on the data protection bill, it was a lot about we are done with the imperialism of data. So, I just wanted to discuss with you guys, what are your thoughts? Because I feel that this is sort of becoming like people want, this is an era of technology dominance. So everybody is sort of trying to protect their own technology, but where does it leave the communities? Where does it leave their labor rights? While I'm in sort of between. I don't completely agree with data localization, and there are reasons for it. We can go in more depth. And I neither agree that data should be available for the world. That Indian data, for example, Indian data has been misused for the longest time. I don't want that either. So just wanted to pick your brains, like everybody's, and what are your thoughts around this?
Okay. Does anybody else want to go? Yeah.
Yeah. With the internet, there are a lot of choices. But right now, what is happening with AI? And you talked about the rift where people are actually already having their opinions and are not willing to, have an argument about it. It is because, you must have logged into Google while you're watching YouTube, for example. YouTube, once you have clicked on a certain type of video, for example, a pro CAA video, it will show you like items. So basically, it is making opinions stronger about a certain thing that you already believe in, rather than trying to create a new belief or something like that. Then again, with data protection, I actually want to connect it to a more in terms of trade, in international economics, protectionism or protection of the local industry, as they called it in international economics, was the reason why they used to make like large export duties, not letting international players directly invest. We are moving as an economy away from that. But in the realm of data, that is very interesting, because data is not something that you want to protect and cater your own data yourself. So, for example, in the industry terms, the infant industries will grow, then we will get the foreign competition, is kind of the narrative that protectionism protectionism in terms of international economics or international trade. So what the point that I was making is that with data protection is actually not like industry protection as we talk about, in terms of trade and everything. And if we as a nation or our governments can, I mean, I don't know where this is going as a international community, but maybe in the future there will be something called as the data trade or data exchange, where citizens' personal data might be exchanged between governments, as showing just showing love towards each other. So yeah, I mean, that's where I would like to end.
Okay, great. So, see, protectionism in terms of protecting your citizens and their privacy is one thing. And it's a great selling point. It sells really, really well. It pulls votes like nobody's business. The defense sector is currently, in my opinion, being used to a large extent like an endorsement model for a lot of product, largely in the political domain. So it's a good business to say that, hey, I'm protecting you, I'm doing a good job of it, and so vote for me or pay me money or whatever the incentive is that you're getting back in terms of protection. Starts from the mafia that says, pay me because then I won't hurt you, to right up to the top where it says pay me because you love your country. It's about the same, but cynicism aside, I think we are looking at a time when countries want more control over the narrative. And it's not just countries, it's really anybody who has any power, how they dominate the rest of the people around them, given that physical resources are scarce. Hiring a security guard or an army to enforce your will is difficult. It's far cheaper to use information as a tool, because it's just cheap to replicate, and it's, as long as you have access, you can kind of keep building a narrative, and you can keep getting people to buy into it. Now, obviously, this works better if you also have a little bit of control on the channel and the storage of the information, because then you can really drive the narrative, and you can get rid of other people's conflicting narratives. More importantly, I mean, what you do to drive your own narrative is not so important as what you do to get rid of other people's narratives. And so that's really what data protectionism is all about. Look, if we were living in an open world, right thinking people in all parts of the world think alike. Everybody who's looking to a collaborative future is trying to cut their consumption, is trying to make more friends, is trying to find ways to coexist. All those things, it's kind of common across the board. And people who are kind of on the other side in terms of wanting to do it their way are claiming that they're doing the same exact thing, but they're doing it in a different way by going with identity versus activity. So if you take this back on, I mean, I recently had access to a master's in social work course at home. So I heard about this, I learned about this new set of terms, or an older set of terms, called Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. So there's two kinds of communities that you can think of. One is based on who you are, and one is based on what you do. So the ones that are based on what you do are linked on behavioral patterns, like all people who want to eat organic food kind of hang out at the same cafes. Versus who you are communities are more like, if you belong to a particular religion or a particular identity, whether or not you subscribe to the behaviors, you will be treated as part of that community. So these are two ways of looking at community models. At Hackergram, we kind of wanted to do a little bit of both. So we said hai aur kar dono chahiye, and so it's Hackergram. But that aside, those are the decisions people are having to make right now. So when you see data protection in terms of the bill that's coming up, the bill itself is probably a good basis for a follow-on call. And we should do that probably as a next call. I'll have to do some research before I get into specifics on the bill. I definitely don't want to make factual errors in terms of law. But the broad intention is that it's control of the narrative and knowledge of the narratives that are going on. It's like they kind of go hand in hand. If you don't know what the other person's narrative is, you don't know how you want to tweak your own. So from everybody's point of view, a certain amount of open internet is a good thing. but too much of open internet is a bad thing. So just as you kind of expressed your own dilemma on this, that you don't want data to be available to everybody, but you don't want it to be completely localized either. So there's a bipolar pull and push on this, and somewhere in the middle is the optimal point where it's going to sit down and rest. And that's the tussle that we are in right now. So everybody's going to have to express their opinion, which means that when the consultations in the public facing dialogue on this opens up, everybody should be participating. We've seen good things happen when people do that. Net neutrality debate, the current protests, they're all good examples of people expressing very, very clearly what they think and feel. So I think that's going to be important in this. But in terms of my own thoughts on data protection is very simple. If one thing that it's immediately going to do is I'm hoping it's going to build up the data center business within India, which means if there's a case for data centers within India, there's a better case for connectivity. The infrastructure is likely to improve. Those economic benefits, and it's a whole sector for livelihood to exist in. It's an area which we are somewhat competent in, so we would be very keen to see how we can participate in that boom if it ever shows up. The flip side, of course, is yes, it means more control for the government. It means a step towards more China-like behavior. But if you think about it, it's the same with the US. They've got most of their data on site in the country, so they can afford to be magnanimous. If we had it that way, we could also afford to, think in terms of openness, that, hey, our data is protected, we don't need to worry about it. So, let's talk about open data in the world. It really depends on who we elect into power and what policies we allow to come into force and how they're implemented. So when you have a bill where government agencies are excluded from the ambit of things that other people are included, it's something to worry about, definitely something to talk about. So that's an area which would be very, very interesting to explore and see, what kind of concessions the government has given itself, and how much of concern are those really? Because already in this country, with or without the PDP bill, the control of the state on the internet and the communications infrastructure is huge. I mean, it's all entirely state controlled or state influenced or state managed in most cases. I mean, the bulk of the telecom sector owes the government a huge amount of money at this point. They just lost the AGR case. And you really don't have a very strong case to make for dissent when you're in debt. So there's that issue going on. Private players, apart from the big ones who are already in debt, are very few and far between. So essentially, the government already controls the internet discourse. So whether if we allow a law to come in, to my mind, it actually opens up the room for a legal debate and a parliamentary debate, and stuff in the Supreme Court, stuff on the internet, a conversation. It's a way of democracy. If you start saying that hey, this bill is wrong and it should not be in there, they already have control. It'll just be extrajudicial, and you won't have any law to kind of bring to court anything. So those are the kind of thoughts that I have about the PDP and the upcoming privacy discourse in India.
I think we resonate on a lot of terms. I want to bring up how this bill has been introduced, like the genesis of this bill. This bill, there was a standing parliamentary committee which essentially vets the bill, which was set up after the Sri Krishna committee that gave a whole lot of ideas that how data protectionism and personal data protection bill should come around. The first time when the bill came, there was a lot of hue and cry because, like you also expressed, if we have data centers in India, it opens a lot of job possibilities. We have a lot of data. It will generate a lot of opportunities. But honestly, comparing it with the current regime and the kind of ideas it has, it worries me. Like, one is much worrisome than the other for me personally. Because, for example, let's see how the protests have been happening. The police in Delhi has used facial recognition systems, AI, to recognize people who are protesting. How is that okay?
It was solidly endorsed by China. China was extremely happy with us for having pulled that off. They were like, hey, look at India. See, they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. So we are at that position where China is quoting India's example. So for me, that stage is really worrisome than having data centers here, because of the very fact what regime is in power and what is the undercurrent of it. If you in the next call, let's go into the details of this PDP bill, because and also I want to mention that this PDP bill is now available for the public to comment. I can to the link where you can send in your comments, and I would highly recommend that all of us put our minds together and individually or as a group we send our thoughts, because as corporates sending in their comments, and
So,
we don't have
So I'd love to make the next call a kind of a wider consultation. We'll do a bit of hygiene editing on this one and put it up, and let's see if people show up and we can have a broader conversation and maybe come up with a collective response. It would be great to do that.